Let's stand up. No justice.
No peace.
No justice.
No peace.
No justice.
No peace.
No racist.
No peace.
No racist.
No peace.
It's time to fight back.
I'm Sabrina Jordan from Dayton, founder of Ohio Families United Against Police Brutality. I just wanted to say welcome and thank you for coming out today to support. We need the support. And I want to be a little more specific about what that support looks like.
Hello, and welcome to the EFFF IT Hour, where we express feelings, facts, and fallacies using words that start with the letter F. I'm your hostess, Karla Carey. Today, we're in a different studio. We've been invited to OSU by Dr. Matt. Thank you, Dr. Matt. I appreciate this.
I appreciate that y'all are here.
Today, our F word is fluidity. And the panel today is an amazing group of people who's going to share with us about the LGBTQ community and inform us and enlighten us so that when we walk away from this table, we walk away better informed on how to interact in the community. First of all, Dr. Matt, I'd like to know, can you please explain to us what LGBTQ means?
Certainly, Karla. LGBTQ stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, and encompasses a whole host of identities that hover around gender and sexuality.
Okay, that's good to know because I think oftentimes we use terminologies, but we don't really know what it stands for. And so we foolishly and look kind of crazy saying the wrong stuff, right?
Right.
So this today is going to be that education, that lesson, so that we do identify people the right way, right?
Yeah.
So I want to start off by asking, how long have you lived in your truth? And with that, I'm going to start with Kenny. If you would mind sharing a little bit of your journey with us, please.
Yes, so my name is Kenneth Eaddy. My pronouns are he, him, his. I would say that my journey started out in my teenage years, and I really started to accept my truth around mid-20s.
Okay. How about you, Mel?
Hello, everyone. My name is Melachi Carroll. I go by Mel. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I came out as a lesbian in my teen years, and then in my adult years, I came out 8 years ago as transgender.
Interesting. Matt?
I'm Dr. Matt Wilmot, and I go by he, they pronouns. I accepted myself and my truth in my late teenage years and became open about my sexuality in my early 20s.
Wow, interesting. And Genesis?
Hello, my name is Genesis Vaughn. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. I would say as far as sexuality, I started kind of living and accepting my truth in my late teenage years, but as far as gender identity, that started more around 23 years old, so kind of, early to mid 20s.
Okay, so as each one of you spoke, you talked about pronouns, and I learned about pronouns in English. Tell me how it differs in the gay community, because I've noticed on Zoom calls, people have their pronouns. And I was confused when I first saw that. So can somebody explain to me what it means to use the pronouns and why?
I think the use of pronouns are important because it helps to identify who you are. As you enter the room, other people will know who you are as well. So there's no question. And then for those that are still getting used to the idea of pronouns, like people choosing their own pronouns, it's really just a simple exercise. I've had a couple of coworkers who were at ends because they were like, oh, well, it doesn't make sense grammatically. I can't use they. I'm like, well, yeah, you can. They are over there. And it's really that simple. Yeah. So it's just continuing to put it into practice, but it really just validates that person's space there, that they are here, and
Okay.
you recognize them.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, I was confused when I first saw it, and it wasn't just people from the gay community that used the pronouns. People in general were using them, and I felt so lost, well, I need to have something under my name, but why? So the why is more important for me to understand that than the fact that it's being used. So with the pronouns, does that help with the misgendering, would you say, Mel?
I think it helps with the misgendering, and it also helps to let someone know that they're in a welcome space.
Oh,
that you're
okay.
in a safe
Yes.
place.
Okay, good. So when we talk about misgendering, and I know we've shared this conversation before, but Mel and Genesis, how does that feel to you? Because I know as we continue to try and get used and comfortable with the conversations, sometimes hearing a voice that doesn't seem like it may match up, like if there were no pictures or no faces, right? Then I could see how the misgendering could happen. But what does that feel like inside when it does happen, Genesis?
I would say it creates a very kind of hyper-conscious experience for myself where I, being a non-binary trans woman, see myself in one way, but when I walk into a room and someone refers to me as he, him, his, sees me as a man, that then creates this experience of something isn't really translating exactly. And so it can be kind of distancing from oneself whenever misgendering is experienced.
Understood. Do you have a different
Yeah,
take
and
on
I
that?
also feel like that it can be traumatizing as well, and it puts you in a fearful situation. Let's say because my voice is not deep enough and someone misgenders me, then someone who is transphobic that want to do harm to a trans person, that puts me in a light where I'm actually someone that they would actually, harm.
Okay. maybe I jumped the gun when I asked about misgendering. Can you explain what misgendering actually is?
So yeah, misgendering is calling someone by the name they didn't want to be called by. So it could be, and I use the word dead name. Dead name is the name that you were given at birth versus the name that you've chosen.
Okay.
And to be misgendered is to call someone by a gender they're not comfortable with going as.
Okay, interesting. Wow. So there's so many places that I really feel like I want to go with this, right where we're at right now. When you talk about being harmed through the misgendering and people not understanding, explain to me what that means to you.
Yeah. So for me, coming out as a lesbian, people used violence towards lesbians, right? Mm-hmm. And then to come out as a trans man, a black trans man at that, during the Black Lives Matter movement as well, then I am now a threat to others, and to be misgendered puts me in a whole different light than it is another light.
I understand where you're going with that now. And it makes sense to me. I've read several articles about gay, trans, lesbian who have been harmed and killed, right? Simply because of who they are and how they identify. So that does make sense to me when you say that, even though in my mind, I'm thinking, well, why? But just like we as Black people experience, the racial tension and it makes sense. So while I'm talking about racial, do you, Matt, feel like there's discrimination or that it's more or less prevalent in the gay community, amongst the gay community?
There's a different but still highly potent level of discrimination, race-based discrimination in the gay community. And often it's disguised in words that try to diffuse the hurt. So people will say like preference, or it's a fetish, or that's described by like an attribute that they want to see in Black, gay or lesbian or trans people. And for me personally, when I got to Columbus, it became more apparent how this stigma isn't localized to any particular area. It's pervasive. Mm-hmm. And with the development of online gay cultures and settings, there's this transfer of norms that people adopt, and that's reflected in their lingo. So for example, when I was single, I would go on the apps and I would see people, a lot of white gay men put like, oh, I'm into BBC. For our viewers, that is not the British Broadcasting Corporation. You'll find out, Google it or Urban Dictionary, but things like that. Or they were like, I remember for example, I put like a pic of myself on the dating apps, and I was just in a t-shirt and whatever, and didn't get any traction. But then I posted one time, just as an experiment, a shirtless pic, and I was working out at the time. I was bodybuilding at the time. I mean, you can kind of see, a little bit of that.
Yeah.
And it was like the floodgates had opened, because all these like white gay men were flooding my DMs and like asking like, oh, okay, do you work out? Like, we should hang out and stuff. And I'm like, y'all not wanting to hang out. Y'all just want, yeah. And so it's often the case that with you would expect that a group like a marginalized group mm-hmm. to also develop some level of solidarity right. across the understanding that we are discriminated based on our sexuality, mm-hmm. but oftentimes that can be a way to mask latent prejudices.
Okay, Genesis, what about you? Have you had any similar experiences as to what Matt has described?
I definitely have, not only in terms of just sexuality, but also being a Black trans person. There is this hyper fetishization of, Black trans women. And a lot of times this is reflected in language such as, oh, you're like the best of both worlds, and just kind of really treating Black trans people as objects or, a means to an end of other people's, sexual fantasies, rather than like actually acknowledging our humanity and even, what we see as pleasure or, relationships. So.
I guess there's some of these things that you guys speak about that I never really thought you encounter, right? I mean, as a Black woman, I know going to a club and being hit on because maybe I'm the new face in the club or I'm a Black woman, whatever. So I know what that looks like. But to feel the discrimination with amongst your own community, I just guess I thought that didn't happen. I thought it was all encompassed, like we are the world. This is us. And we don't go outside of this realm to harm each other. Have you experienced any of that, Mel?
So as a Black trans man, I have experienced that on a number of occasions, but the one that sticks out the most, not just to me, but for a lot of Black trans men or trans men period, the fetish, like Genesis was saying, but Black trans men who have been sexually abused or raped, and those things go unreported because you're being demasculinized. So no one is going to say, I got assaulted, and so you have to find yourself in places where you're always cautious of your people, places, and things. Your whole surrounding.
Yeah. If I could just add something,
Absolutely.
I think what's interesting is that many within the white LGBTQ community think that the default of what they experience as far as their them as whether as gay men or as trans men or trans women is seen as the default and therefore is put as the face of hurt and harm. And I think that's often there are often layers to it that people do not consider as being more, I think, more complex and therefore worthy of investigation, and that it's often seen as like we can simply just put this narrative out there of how trans people experience these things, but not talk about the other layers of it's not just like transphobia, but it's also racial bias, anti-Blackness, and I think that's why we're seeing, especially within our communities, there is this like almost willful ignorance to not talk about it and to really put yourself in an uncomfortable position as a white cisgender or white transgender person to say, wow, I can't believe like I've contributed to this by just being silent or not even going out of my own way. It's just infuriating often.
Yeah.
Can I say
Yeah, go ahead, please.
So with me, I was very naive to that until I had a supervisor who's a white gay man. He said, be careful when you go to certain clubs because they're very transphobic and very racist. And I was like, everyone loves me, I'm male, but to actually see that actually happen, it's like, wow, that really exists. There's actually racism within our community, and there's people who actually want to harm, people just because of the color of their skin or because they're trans, and I was naive. I didn't realize it until a few years ago. I was like, wow, this really happens.
Yeah.
I hate to interrupt. I need to know I'm understanding. Are you saying within the LGBTQ community you have been attacked for being trans?
Yes.
From,
Yes.
Did you say?
From Caucasian gay men, and to be honest, from aggressive lesbians that are African American.
Really? So, okay, so help me understand, why is that? Especially when you talk about lesbians.
I'm not an expert, but this is just my theory.
Your experience.
My theory.
Yeah.
You know, I'm living my truth where someone else cannot.
That's good. That's good. Okay, so I'm going to shift just a little bit. There's two phrases that you guys brought up that I need some clarity on. Cisgender and non-binary. Who can give me one or both or your opinions? Or
So, from my understanding, cisgendered simply means that the gender that you were assigned at birth is the same gender that you accept now. So if you were born a male and you accept yourself as a male, then that's considered cisgendered. So that can be regardless of your sexual identity, because you can be a cisgendered gay man, meaning you accept yourself as gay, but or as a man, but you also know that you are attracted to men.
Okay.
So the gender doesn't necessarily connect to your sexual identity. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. It does. So then, Genesis, can you share non-binary?
Yeah, so non-binary basically refers to kind of a variety of ways in which someone may not identify with the categories of strictly man or woman, male or female, masculine or feminine. And so this can include, identities such as genderqueer. Some people, like myself, do identify just as non-binary. And so it can refer to a wide variety of ways in which people see themselves outside or maybe somewhere in between that binary rather than existing on strictly one pole or the other.
So to help me out,
Go ahead.
Non-binary woman. Are those not contradictory?
In terms of my identity, I would say not, because in the sense of understanding kind of like my core self, I kind of, identify with what we can say the chaos of gender. In terms of myself being a non-binary trans woman, I see that as kind of describing like my whole self, where I identify with kind of the chaos of gender, we can say, with, kind of the endless possibilities between man and woman. But in terms of existing and moving throughout the world, I do find comfort with womanhood and femininity. And so that is kind of the main reason why I would identify myself as a non-binary trans woman. And those actually being able to be compatible rather than necessarily exclusive of one another.
Okay.
And I just want to say too, I think that continues the broader discussion of like fluidity, which is what our word is today. Just that as you continue to grow and evolve, so can your understanding of these constructs, but also for each individual person, they may, begin and accept themselves as lesbian, but then they may move over to non-binary or what have you. And it's their natural progression. And I don't think we've always had terms necessarily, like even in ancient times with different cultures, with African culture, with indigenous people, they didn't necessarily have a term, but they understood masculine and feminine energies couldn't exist in us all. So I know, for example, in Hawaiian culture, they call it mahu, which is basically like they understand that a person can have both male and female energies. but they don't, they don't ostracize you for it. They understand that it's more of a spiritual connection more so than sexual necessarily.
Right. And to just add that, oftentimes that brings a level of reverence from other people because there is a gift, a sense of cultural understanding of how fluid gender is and how fluid sexuality can be. And this is kind of to branch off Kenny's point that this is also often in African cultures as well, even Caribbean cultures. Often people were seen as who were occupied fluid identities were healers. Even within Caribbean culture, which is my background. People who were seen as like what are called obia men or obia women and stuff. Those were terms that were gendered later on during colonialism. But prior to that, they were obias or like words like that, and they could pass as women or men or either. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm actually interested right now, and I was talking about this with my fiance, that I'm interested because on my mom's side, my mom's uncle is an obia person, and I've always been curious to know, like, did they identify as queer and so they're still alive, and so I'm interested to one day go and meet them
have that conversation.
Yeah, have that conversation. Even if they don't identify, they would have so much information to give on that topic.
And I also think that it's important to know that it's not up to us to identify someone's pronouns or what they are. It's up to us to respect. Respect comes in three forms: self-earned and given. You have to give respect to get respect.
Right.
So I'm really big on respect. So whatever that person's pronouns are, or their gender ideas, it's up to us to respect
that. Yeah.
And to if anyone is interested, like our viewers as well, the work by Sandra Bem, B-E-M last name, she was a psychologist who talked about the fallacy regarding the gender binary, and specifically putting men and women at opposite poles on a spectrum, and that actually there are two spectrums, where there's one spectrum for high versus low masculinity and one for high versus low femininity. And I think that just framing helps, I think, can help people to really understand, at least at a surface level, why, like, how much of our experience can be influenced by just that understanding.
So when we talk about trans men and trans women, is it ever that you're identified just a trans man or just a trans woman, or is it I identify as a woman or I identify as a man? Like, what's the difference, or is there a difference in how that's identified? Anybody?
I think that's clearly up to that individual.
Okay.
Me personally, I identify as a trans man, and for me, I identify that way so younger people know that they're not alone, and that they don't have to feel like something is wrong with them, because people like me exist, people like them exist. So that's why it's important to me. Now, I know people who identify as self, and that means they identify specifically as a man or a woman, and they don't talk about their past. But for me, and it's just for me, my past is what made me.
Good.
Yeah, and just to touch on kind of the last point that Mel was talking about, as far as people who don't speak about their past, that is often referred to as being stealth. So pretty much, someone who transitions to either being a man or a woman, but they do not make any mention of their trans identity. And then to kind of go back to Karla's question, I myself definitely do identify as a trans woman, just similar to what Mel said, in the sense of the power within visibility. And I think that's something that's very important as we see so many bills across the country that are trying to deny access to trans healthcare, especially for minors. We see these bills that are limiting any discussion of gender identity or sexual orientation within the classroom. And so I think it's really important to show our young people that, you know, there are people who have that similar experience with you, and people like everyone at this table are in the fight to, you know, be able to have a world in which you can live in your full truth as well.
Absolutely.
And I totally understand why some people don't come out as trans man or trans woman, because back to what I was saying about the violence, you know, and I think that's a big part of it for them.
And it makes sense. So, and that was what I was going to ask you, like, but you explained it. Why not say I'm a man? Because it eliminates that piece of it of having to be targeted.
Yeah.
But I also respect the fact that you recognize that who all of you are is a symbol to some child who doesn't know how to have that conversation, how to identify. So have any of you ever had, like, have you had to mentor a younger person in that situation? You smile, Mel.
Yeah. Up until about a month ago, I was part of the Big Brothers Big Sisters program, where I was a big brother to a trans boy. Mm-hmm. And it meant a lot. I had to stop doing it because I didn't have enough time to dedicate just to him. So, and I had to step away. I didn't want to, but I had to. Okay. But I mentor a lot of people, and not just children. I mentor adults who are just coming into themselves, you know, and I take pride in walking the walk and showing them, because I didn't have that growing up. Mm-hmm. So it's important to me to help someone who was me.
Wow. So I'm going to cross this line that I've had this conversation with people, right? So as I shared this journey of today, being able to sit with you all and have this conversation, one of the questions people has asked me is why? And my answer or reply was, why not? Why are we afraid to learn the things that we don't know that help us be comfortable in spaces with people that we don't understand? And it doesn't have to be that, you know, it just happens to be that today we're talking about LGBTQ, but it could be something else, right? I just think it's important. The more we learn, the better we can interact with people. But so one of the questions that was posed to me was about religion. And I don't want to cross any barriers. So I'll preface this, that if it's too sensitive, I get it. But, you know, I've gone to church most of my life. And, you know, this isn't cliche, but my choir director was gay, right? And people look at gay people in the church as though it's like this abomination to man, and how people feel about, you know, it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. I have no heaven or hell to put a person in, right? So I don't judge. Each of us have committed some sin, right? That's who we are as people. So I wouldn't judge anybody in what they've done or haven't done, because I know the things that I've done. But how have your experiences, if you have a religious experience, how has that been inside the church? Anybody have church experiences?
I'll start.
Okay. Uh-oh, you say that kind of reluctantly.
So there's a lot to unpack. But I will say, for many, church hurt is real. Mm-hmm. For me, I've had a mixture of different experiences as it relates to church. Mm-hmm. My mother's side of the family is Jehovah's Witness. My father's side of the family, some were Baptist, some were Seventh-day Adventist. Okay. So I had all of that in the house at one point at the same time. So I'm just like, do I go to the Kingdom Hall? Do I go on Saturday? Do I go on Sunday? Do I go to Wednesday Bible studies? So everybody leave me alone? Like, it was a lot. But yeah, for me, I feel like you can't try to enact God's will without enacting God's love. And if you omit love, that's the end of the conversation. I created a monologue of my life through my vantage point of how intersectionality and all that plays, especially with religion, a few years back, called Chrysalis Epic. And it talks about that, where people in those positions of power would try to use religious doctrine as a form of shame and conversion and all this. And I eventually got to the point where I said, I can't follow your God, because what you're preaching to me is not what you're actually living. And when it came specifically with my parents, it was like, okay, when I leave, like, that's just going to be it. Like, because I can't split my life, and you can only tolerate one part of me and not the other, or you hang on to 14-year-old Kenny because in your eyes that was before he started to dabble in the gay, you know. And then after that, like, after owning it in some respects, everything I did then after was because of that. I was like, no, I'm going to college because I want to do better for myself. It has nothing to do with my sexuality. But for a lot of people, they couldn't see past the sexuality. And I said, you know, for me, it's like, well, that's a part of the whole of who I am. So, but that's all you can think about. And it was really rough. But for me, yeah, I've gone more so away from this construct of religion and more for just like a spiritual walk, and it's just about a relationship. So I definitely believe that there is a God. I believe in the power of the universe and manifestation and all that. And I have talks with God every day. Like, I cuss God out every day. If there's something going on, and then, you know, the universe comes back and say, "Are you done?" And I'm like, okay, I just really need to vent. And then I just keep moving. But I'll also say too that for a lot of these social constructs, race, religion, gender, and all that stuff, these are things that were perpetuated by colonialization. And whether people realize that or not, it's a very real thing. I remember reading from some religious scholars and theologians who talked about how people who were in power to like change words in books were able to get publishers to change certain words or mistranslate certain words to mean certain things. Because a lot of times I've always heard growing up that homosexuality was connected to pedophilia. And it's not at all. And for the viewers that are listening, you can research this on your own. I will always preface this by saying research anything any of us are saying so you can be educated. But there's a word that I believe was translated from Latin to German. It was mistranslated when they talk about the whole Sodom and Gomorrah and that whole story in the Bible. And it was translated to boy, meaning men should not sleep with boys as they do women. And they connected that to say, oh no, it's really like homosexuality. But no, it was pedophilia. Like no adult man should try to sleep with a little boy. But they've ran with it, and that's been this whole religious like push every time you hear a sermon. And it seems like every time I've gone into a church, that's always a topic, is homosexuality. Meanwhile, you have a gay musical director, and it's like, well, y'all be hard pressed to find hymns and songs to sing to, because a lot of your composers are of the community. So I liken it to what Dr. Matt talked about earlier, like the Obia people. I feel like if they were of a spiritual connection, like a lot of them probably also will recognize as queer, but they are connecting you just to the spirit, to the message, not necessarily the doctrine. So yeah.
That was good. That was good.
Absolutely.
Mel, Matt.
I can offer, if I could offer a citation just to that.
Sure.
Check out Kathy Baldock. She is a theologian scholar. She actually did this deep background research, and I'll be short with this, where she researched a scholar who at the time was just coming out of the seminary when they started to change or I guess update the new, what they call now, like the new Revised Standard Version, the new International Version, NKJV, all those translations. And the young scholar at the time wrote about how those changes that you just mentioned were going to stigmatize the group. This was back in the 50s, maybe 60s, and one of them was like just the quote, the scripture, the passage from scripture you mentioned of like, do not sleep with a boy as you would with a woman, and then also like the other, I think it was like the 7 deadly sins and stuff, and one of them, or the abominations, I guess, and it changed from sexual perversion to homosexuality, and the scholar wrote and said this could potentially be detrimental to a swath of people, and they still rolled with that, and it's ironic because I if anyone wants to challenge me, I could go for days, because I did this research especially for Pride. Prior to that, the United Methodist Church had in their doctrine that people who were sexual minorities, and at that time they were saying homosexuals, should be treated with love and care and respect. This was before 1967. Okay. After that, that was scrapped. It was scrapped. They took it away. So prior to that, in the early 20s and stuff, or early 20th century, people were, I wouldn't say like accepting, but they were tolerant. They were tolerant. But because of these changes, and as Kenny alluded to, at a level of exercising power and limiting those who are powerless, it's created this, what we see right now as this continuation of stigma and prejudice and transphobia and homophobia. Yeah.
You know, I'm looking at you, Mel.
So as I stated before, my name is Melachi. The meaning of Melachi is messenger of God, or God's messenger. For me, the Lord is my shepherd. He knew I was gay when I was born. He knew he knew who I was going to be. I firmly believe that God puts everybody on a path. You have to be careful who you're targeting, because you don't know what path God has set them on.
True, very true.
I actually had an incident where I was at a church, and they needed a person to lead Sunday school, because I was brought up in the church as a PK. I knew I could teach Sunday school to the youth. The lady who was over the Sunday school, which is the preacher's wife, said, "Well, how would I tell them that why you dress like you dress?" And I was like, I said, I can bring more souls to Christ in my authentic self than you can in all of your sin.
Wow.
That same lady called me and said, "Hey, Halloween is coming up. Would you like to donate candy?" "Oh, my candy is too gay. My candy is too gay. I can't." How are you going to explain where you got the candy from? So you have to be careful, very careful, how you treat people.
True.
I'll say quickly too to that. There are a lot of walking contradictions with people, especially when it comes to church, because those same people they will make a hallelujah night to give themselves a pass on a pagan holiday. You know, many people will still say that Christ was born in December and say that that's his birthday in December 25th. It's like, well, what proof do you have? Like, does it actually say in your verses in your book that you claim is the Bible that he was born December 25th? Like, okay.
But Kenny, their gay hairstylist is the one who did their hair for that event.
Right. Right.
I'm just saying.
Right. And it's the same one, they'll have, it's not Resurrection Sunday, because they've moved away from saying Easter. Because that's a pagan holiday, but you'll still have the egg hunt in the church, in the main church yard, but then talk about, third day and he died and all that. And it's like, y'all are a bunch of walking contradictions every time. And it's like you continue to give yourselves passes as though we don't see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
So,
but you have to continue to walk in your walk. You know what I'm saying? You can't tell me something just like our kids. We can't tell our kids to do right and we're doing wrong.
Right, right.
And it's the same difference.
Yeah, I would say, honestly, in terms of religion, like Kenny mentioned, like church hurt, like I was afraid of that. I would say most of my, previous church family back in Cleveland probably doesn't know that I'm queer, more than definitely know that they don't know that I'm trans. And honestly, I kind of like ran away from church because I was afraid of that hurt. No one wants that experience of like being an outcast. But I would say just now, like I'm getting back to a point of, okay, like what religion, like what would that look like in my life? Would it be Christian? If so, would it be Protestant, Catholic? I went to Catholic school from kindergarten all through high school. Would it be another religion, Islam, Judaism, anything like that? So I think I'm in kind of this very wandering phase of, spirituality, and I'm kind of enjoying it all as I look through.
But church bullying is a thing, bullying. And it's bullying inside the church.
I don't think that you have to be gay to experience that. You could be the girl who comes in the really short dress that sits too close to the front where the pastor's preaching, and somebody has something, they're going to come over and give you the lap cloth, right? So many things have changed in the church as I remember it from a little kid till now. But the one thing that I can say that has remained constant that I've seen are gay people within the church. And a couple of churches that I have visited, it's obvious, right? And it's accepted. It's accepted. So if you're tithing, who's going to complain about what your choices are if you're giving money to the church?
Because they will never turn away the money. Exactly.
So my whole thing about that is if we're going to stand firm on what we believe in, then stand firm on it. If you don't like gay people in your church, don't take their money, right? Because then it becomes hypocritical to me. And it makes me sit back and look and go, but that's okay, but that's not. Either it is to you or it isn't. And whatever rules you set for your church or whatever, wherever you're at, I feel like, because I'm an open book, and I believe that a person should be able to live their life. I don't care what you do. As long as it doesn't infringe upon others, the way you want to live your life is your business. And who am I to point a finger at you? My life is far from perfect.
The word says, come as you are.
Come as you are.
And that doesn't necessarily mean clothing.
Exactly. There's drug addicts that go into the church because the church is supposed to be to heal the sick, right? And so do we criticize them because they came in from last night being out getting high? No. We welcome them in because we want to help them. We want to save your soul. We should be open to any and everybody who wants to be saved, I don't know, we could go on and on about this.
Our job is to bring people to Christ, not kick them away.
Yes.
Turn them away.
Yes. Okay, the other topic that is, I might not be favored after I say this piece, but I'm going to bring this topic up. First of all, is anybody a sports fan?
Yeah.
Yeah. Basketball, football, whatever. Okay. So my personal feeling, I have, and correct me or guide me, but I have concerns because I have daughters, right? My daughters competing against a trans woman who, I feel it coming. I feel it coming. You shifted in your seat. Because theoretically, that trans woman, so help me frame this right, you guys, because I don't want to say it wrong. Mm-hmm. The gender that they were born into, that male gender that they were born into, is stronger in most cases than my daughters. So if my daughters are running track, I personally feel like it's an unfair advantage for that trans woman to run track against my daughters. Now, I don't know if anybody agrees or disagrees, but that's one of the issues that I have. So somebody help me out here.
So I would say, I think it's important to, at first, even just get into the science component of it. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times this comes up with the NCAA, where they regulate that, trans women have to be on hormone replacement therapy, also known as HRT, for a certain amount of time before they compete within women's sports.
Like a year or so, something like that?
I think something like that, yeah. And I think what's important to understand is kind of like the effects of estrogen. So there are going to be concrete things where you are weaker, you have less muscle tone, energy can be up and down and all over the place. And I think a lot of people, they don't, actually know that or even understand that component of it. A lot of people think, oh, it's like the bone structure, like that's instantly an advantage, but it's really not. In a sense, we do say to trans women, like, you have to lower your testosterone, and then with that, weaken yourself in order to actually compete along women. And when I say weaken, I don't mean it in like a oppressive sense, but I mean that just like in the sense that, you do have to go through some sort of biological intervention. So I think just that on the science portion, but I think there's even just like a whole lot that we can really unpack when we start talking about like the language in which trans women are referred to when it comes to sports, and even cisgender women who have, higher than normal levels of testosterone in their body. That's a case that you see quite clearly with Caster Semenya. So I think it's, a lot that can really go into it.
Yeah, I'm feeling the same way as Genesis is feeling on this one. And that's just because on a trans man's level, taking testosterone boosts your muscle tone and your muscle strength versus being, a cisgender man. Like right now, my testosterone level is higher than the average man my age. And that's because of the testosterone level in my system.
Okay. Kenny, I saw you.
Yeah, I had written down notes and I was like trying to get them together. I guess my viewpoint is, in the case, let's say, of a trans woman, I would say, would there be a disadvantage if a trans woman was forced to play against a man, a cisgendered man? Like, are you forcing them to think about biology more so, or like where they are like accepting in their walk?
So I get that piece, right? I get that piece. But I also look at like, what was the swimmer's name? Where she competed against women. Now, when she competed against men, she was like number 400 and something, right? Then when she competed against the women, she won. And so to me, it just seems like an unfair advantage to me. I haven't done a lot of research on that. I know we talk about research, and there's a lot of things that I do research on. That hasn't been one. So I'll have to take your advice and look at the scientific piece of it. Go back to see, maybe even understand the getting the the estrogen shots and how that affects, because I know it is a year that they have to wait before they can compete. So I will do my due diligence and look that up and have a better understanding. But just on the basis of seeing, reading it or watching it on TV or whatever, I sit and I think like that seems so unfair. So at least you guys have me willing to look deeper into it and get a better understanding.
Yeah.
And I have to do some more research on my own too. But I would say even on, like, take out LGBT, like just look at just different athletes, women athletes, men athletes. You can look at someone like a Serena Williams, who is buff, tough, and is knocking everybody out, right?
Sure.
And she gets called by the IOC so many times because they think she's taking supplements that goes against it. And that's just the natural makeup of who she is. She has a lot of, I believe, like a lot more like testosterone, a lot more drive, like in her forces. I mean, like, she's coming with like 130 mile an hour serves, like up there with, her male counterparts. But the only time they question it is when it comes time for like competition. It's like, oh, she's doing something a little extra in her regiment that we need to check. And I would say she probably has had more surprise checkups, the tests than anyone. I think it's just, it really comes down to like what Genesis was starting with, just the science, because some of us may have more estrogen or more testosterone in us just naturally. And again, I have to do some more research as it relates to trans men and women, but I feel like who you accept yourself to be, like how you see yourself in the world, it should be across the board.
Understood.
So I read an article one time that Reggie Miller said that he knew he could play basketball only after he finally beat his sister after so many years.
Okay. Point well taken. So Genesis, I have a question. There's a word that I've heard you toss around a couple times, and so I'm hoping that maybe you can give me a definition so that we can understand. But you've used the word queer. What exactly does queer mean?
Well, a lot of times queer just refers to not only sexual orientation, but also gender identity and expression. And it's used as a way to refer to anything outside of typical, cis normativity, heteronormativity, kind of breaking away from the constraints of, being straight or, cisgender. A lot of times I myself use that in terms of sexuality, where I feel that terms such as, gay or same gender loving might be kind of limiting in terms of like how I actually feel in terms of attraction to people. But I think there's also different ways of, queer in terms of people identifying as genderqueer. So kind of tying back in with non-binary identities. So I think just kind of that general understanding of things that exist outside of heteronormative standards.
Okay. For this reason, and so many others, I'm so glad that we were able to bring this together to bring some understanding and educate some of the ignorant people out there. Labeling and the alphabet. Let's talk about that.
So this is something that I'm recently taking a hard stance on, and only because of what I've been seeing over the years. To me, I think there just shouldn't be labels and as far as like at all. Like we shouldn't care about a acronym per se. Our representation comes from how we live our lives, not what we put on a grant. And I'm not moving. I know some people feel like, we need to, like, because as we find out more about different sexualities and stuff, and how the alphabet has grown from LGBT to LGBTQIA to LGBTQIA2 2+, and so on. We need to stop that. Like I personally just feel like we need to stop that and focus on what's really important in our survival. Like, period.
I say I'm a firm believer in the heart of a man, and when I say man, I use that term loosely. I consider like everybody when I say the heart of a man. But at the end of the day, I don't care what your label is. I really don't. I care about how you treat me, how we interact with each other, and what kind of person you really and truly are as you continue your journey. So if you're gay, straight, bi, trans, and all the other letters that we use in the alphabet to describe who we are as people, it does not matter. So I agree with you, Matt. I agree with you 100% that you could tell me I'm a gay black man. I don't care about that. I care about who you are as Matt, Dr. Matt. And what you do at home, when you're hanging out with your friends, like, that's not my business. But who you are as a person, I see Genesis the same way, right? When we got to have a conversation the other day, one of the things that we talked about is how tall Genesis is. And I don't care, like, what you choose to do later on. I met you as Genesis. You're a beautiful soul to me, and that's what matters. Now, Mel, on the other hand,
It is what it is.
You just get what you get what you ask for.
How God created me.
let me ask, as we kind of bring this to a close, is there any term that you find offensive that people could call you based on your sexuality? Are there any offensive words? Because I'm going to ask, let me ask this before you answer. So I remember way back in the day when a woman was, now we say women are lesbians, but before they were called bulldaggers or studs, right? I don't hear that terminology ever anymore. So I'm assuming that's totally defunct. But are those words offensive now?
I think they still use stud.
Do they?
They don't use
Oh,
stud.
yeah.
I mean, that's a conversation to have with the lesbian community.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think that with that, it depends on where you are in the country.
Oh, okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
Down south, studs.
Oh,
Up
okay.
north, it's dominant or aggressive. You know what I'm saying? It just depends on where you are.
Okay. Okay. Is there anything that you find offensive?
Oh, when I lived the lifestyle as a lesbian, which I came out as a lesbian, but bulldog has always been a bad word.
Okay.
But I also come from an era in time where queer was a bad word. You know what I'm saying? So that's all evolving.
Is butch still acceptable or no?
It depends on what.
Where you are?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Kenny, is there anything that you find offensive?
Not really terms about sexuality. I mean, there are slurs that I just feel like you shouldn't say at all. But me, honestly, the one word that I feel like is offensive across the board, doesn't matter how you connect or label, is stupid. That's the one word that I feel like doesn't matter who you are, how old you are. It's just, don't call anyone that. That's just my own opinion.
Okay.
Especially as like growing up, like as a child, you hear that so many times, you start to believe that.
Okay. Okay.
So for me, that's the word it's offensive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Genesis?
I think as far as sexuality, I mean, just kind of like how Kenny said, like there's plenty of, slurs such as like the F word or even gender identity, the T word.
The T word?
Rhymes with Fanny.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that. Okay,
I
gotcha.
think a lot of people, like they look at that word and like, oh, I thought that was just, short for transgender. And it's like, like.
It's not?
It's not
Okay,
at all.
I never knew that. I've heard people use it. I've never used it because I wasn't sure if or how it should be used, but I did not know that it wasn't short for that.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
But yeah, and then if I could roll back to something that Matt mentioned as far as labels and identity, I think it's important when, like I mentioned before, we have so many of these bills and legislation that we're trying to combat as, queer and trans people. That's terminology that I use. I think it's important that there's power in a label in sense of being able to have language to describe oneself. But I think when we are talking about a movement for queer and trans liberation, it's important that we organize ourselves as a united front, so we can have diversity in terms of, how we understand ourselves and that language, but in terms of action, it's important that we have unity within that. And through that, that's the only way that we can really identify some of these power structures that are oppressing all of us, those being like capitalism, racism, white supremacy more specifically, and being able to, actually understand what does it take to break those down and for all of us to be liberated.
Yeah. Can I chime in a little bit? The word that, or the phrase I picked up from what you just said, Genesis, is coordinated diversity. Coordinated diversity. One where we are united, but we can only be united by coordinating and understanding our differences. Oftentimes we look at diversity, and we see what diversity is playing out as, and it's a gate-kept diversity. We'll only accept you if you're this.
Okay.
We'll only accept masculine presenting trans men or feminine presenting trans women. So there's no room for that education on that diversity. It's just pick and choose who we have.
It's funny that you say that because within the trans community, there's been times where, I've been discriminated against just because I hadn't had a certain surgery.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Even within the trans community, there's been times where I've been discriminated against because I have not had certain surgeries or my voice wasn't deep enough or I didn't have facial hair. It just depends on what group of people that you're around.
Man, so not only do you deal with the discrimination of just being a black person, now you deal with all the other little intricate details that play into who you are as that black person.
So as a trans person, first you deal with family, then you deal with your religion, then you deal if you're going to have a spouse and friends, and then you deal within the community.
Wow. And to think that people think that you just decided to be this way.
No one makes a choice to be discriminated against. No one makes a choice to be hated. And hate is a harsh word, but it's hated.
Yeah.
And to Genesis' point about like the laws that are passed, like people that are part of the LGBT community are not asking for any more rights than a heterosexual person or cisgender person. We're just asking to be equal across the board. I should be able to go into a hospital and see my loved ones if they're sick. I should be able to go to any school I want, get housing if I want. I should be able to live my life just like you. And I believe a lot of these constructs are still based in some privilege for a straight or heterosexual, cisgendered, white evangelical man.
Yes.
And anything
Agreed.
that diverts from that, there's going to be all of these issues with why do you want rights? And it's like, well, I don't want anything more than you.
Yeah.
Like the fact that there was a whole bathroom bill in North Carolina, because when the reality of it is there's one bathroom in your house and everybody used it and it didn't have a label on it.
Say that, Kenny.
So porta potties are the original non-gender bathrooms. What are we doing here? So like those small things like that try to keep a certain group of people in power, or have the minority make the decisions for the rest of the country, is ridiculous to me.
Kenny, you hit on a couple of things that hit me. Homelessness. You know, a trans person can't go to a regular shelter if they're homeless. You know, they're going to go to the men's shelter or the women's shelter. Here in Columbus, there's been times where women were waking up because they didn't pass as a woman. So 3 o'clock in the morning, you got to go. Even when you look at food poverty and food despair, you know, a lot of the places that give out food are actually churches. These are the same churches that have kicked Billy out because Billy is no longer Shelley. And so now people are now needing food, and so now and homeless. So guess what they're going to do now? Okay, let me go sell my body so I can have a place to live and something to eat.
Well, let me say, you all have been an amazing panel with a plethora of information. And I walk away with so much more knowledge now than before I came into this room. My hopes are that the audience actually embraces this whole conversation with a lot of understanding, more compassion, so that as we continue to maneuver through these journeys, we can come together more than be apart, because we are more alike than we are different. No matter how we want to look at it, we are more alike than we are different. Dr. Matt, what a phenomenal idea to bring this panel, this specific panel, not just to have this conversation, but to bring this specific panel to the table. And I appreciate you all laying down personal pieces of your journey that really don't belong to anybody outside of who you are. But the fact that you all were brave enough to come into this safe space and share it, I appreciate it more than you will ever know. Now, what I'm going to ask is that let's not make this the last time we have this kind of conversation. Let's intentionally get back together and intentionally educate people, right? Genesis, thank you so much for sharing. Dr. Matt, thank you for sharing. Mel, thank you for sharing. And Kenny, thank you for sharing. This is the F It Hour, and all I can say is thank you. We're out. Now, I don't know if anybody agrees or disagrees, but that's one of the issues that I have. So somebody help me out here.
Take a breath. I know Karla needs it. She did not look at me.
Yeah, I needed to take a breath after that.
Just so I know.